Good morning. My name is Keats Meyer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Madison Square Park Conservancy, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this morning. It is my great pleasure to be hosting Pamela Joyner, Bernard Lumpkin, and Ron Pizzuti as they discuss reassessing art history. Madison Square Park has remained open throughout the pandemic to provide an outdoor oasis for respite and relief during this pretty wild time. We have seen extensive use of the lawns and extensive gathering of people for protesting and public discourse. We're proud to play that role. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items to mention. If you have a question anytime during the presentation, please type it into the chat function, and there will be a question and answer time later on. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Brooke Kamen-Rappaport, the Martin Friedman Senior Chief Curator, and our Deputy Director. Brooke?
Thank you, Keats. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today to learn from three deeply committed collectors and a wonderful moderator who will speak on the work they do on collecting Black artists and artists of color, and on bringing great impact to the fields of art history and contemporary art. Before I introduce our participants, I'd like to thank our colleagues, Dana Klein and Hannah Sturs, for their work on this program. Madison Square Park Conservancy commissions contemporary artists to realize public art on our 6.2-acre site. We heed artists and their work and are deeply conscious of the responsibility of how the art program's mission coheres with accessibility for all park goers. It's now a great pleasure for me to welcome our speakers. Courtney Willis Blair, our moderator, is a gallerist, writer, and cultural producer in New York. She's director at Mitchell Innes and Nash and manages monographic and group exhibitions, special projects, publications, and major acquisitions with a focus on museums, biennials, and foundations. Her writing has appeared in Forbes, New York, Cultured, and Modern Painters. She is the founder of Entre Nous, a collective body that gathers a network of women of color in the New York art world, and she belongs to Triple Canopy's Publishers Circle. Pamela Joyner is based in San Francisco and Sonoma, California. She is the founder of Avid Partners, where her expertise has been the alternative investment arena. She's a trustee of the Art Institute of Chicago, the J. Paul Getty Trust, SF MoMA, Tate Americas Foundation, as well as a member of the Tate North America Acquisitions Committee. She serves on the Committee on Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. In the education arena, Pamela serves on the board of the Art and Practice Foundation. She was a member of President Obama's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, a trustee of Dartmouth College, the New York City Ballet, and the San Francisco Ballet Association. She's a board member of the MacDowell Colony and also a leader and member of the recently launched steering committee of the Black Trustee Alliance for Art Museums. Bernard Lumpkin is a contemporary art collector, patron, and educator whose commitment to both emerging and established artists of African descent is part of a broader mission of institutional advocacy and support. He sits on the board of the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. At the Whitney Museum, he serves on the Education Committee and on the Painting and Sculpture Committee. At MoMA, he serves on the Media and Performance Committee and is also the vice chair of the Friends of Education. The Lumpkin-Boccuzzi family collection is the subject of a new book, Young, Gifted, and Black, A New Generation of Artists, and a traveling exhibition now on view at Lehman College here in New York City. And Ron Pizzuti is chair and chief executive officer of the Pizzuti Companies in Columbus, Ohio. He is an avid collector of contemporary art, the founder in 2013 of the Pizzuti Collection in Columbus, and since 2018, the Pizzuti Collection at the Columbus Museum of Art. He is a neighbor and trustee of Madison Square Park Conservancy, and he chairs the art committee. Ron is a trustee of the Wexner Center, the Gund Gallery at Kenyon College, and former chair and current honorary trustee of the Columbus Museum of Art. He is former chair and current honorary trustee of the Columbus Symphony, former trustee of Kenyon College, Dominican University, and the Columbus College of Art and Design. Ron is also a former trustee of Site Santa Fe and is a member of the drawing committee of the Whitney Museum. I want to thank our speakers and moderator for joining this program today, and to our speakers for their generosity and support, guidance, patronage of artists, curators, galleries, and institutions. So welcome everyone, and Courtney, on to you.
Thanks, Brooke. Thank you for inviting us here today, and for the whole team at Madison Square Park Conservancy for facilitating this conversation. I also want to thank Bernard, Pamela, and Ron for joining me here to discuss how to support artists and what collecting looks like in this day and age. So I want to get started with the impetus of your collections. And I thought to start with you, Pamela. You really view yourself as an agent of change. And this has dictated not only which artists you support, but which works, how many works, and even which institutions you align yourself with. And I'm curious, how have your personal relationships with artists fostered your collecting in depth?
So this really has been a guidepost of how we collect, because forming close personal relationships with living artists really inform us firsthand about the intentionality of the artist and the positioning of the work. So, I mean, curators certainly play an important role in that as well, but I like to get it firsthand. And because our mission is rewriting the canon or contributing to the rewriting of the canon, the more data I have, the more information I have about the artist's narrative, the better I can position and contextualize the work within our own collection, and also advocate for that artist and that work in the context of the museum collections with which I'm associated.
Thank you so much. Ron, you began your collection about 8 years ago, and your approach to collecting it really seems has been one of abundance. You have more than 2,000 objects. So I'm curious how collecting has changed for you over the last 8 years, and how
actually,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. And how you identify artists and why collecting widely is so important for you.
Well, we actually started collecting in the early 70s, and started a very modest collection because we didn't have any money at the time, and started with a print. It's the only time we ever bought anything on time. The Pace Gallery had an outpost in Columbus, and everything that Arnie Glimcher showed in New York ended up here. So Eva Glimcher became a mentor, and over a period of time, we just expanded the collection. It's global in nature today. The last 8 years, we've focused on Black artists, and with no plan to build a collection of Black artists. I met Lyle Ashton Harris, and then David Hammonds and Kara Walker, and got intrigued with what they do, and ended up owning work from all three of them. And then when we formed the Pizzuti collection, which was 8 years ago, we started bringing in speakers, and Simone Lay and Alex Archea and Hank Willis Thomas was very, very, very instrumental in helping us expand the entry into Black art.
Thank you, Ron. Bernard, I wanted to talk to you about how you anchor yourself as a patron, supporting artists both directly and indirectly. And so could you tell us your mission statement for collecting, and what function do you think your recently published book plays, especially now?
Sure. Thank you, Courtney. And also just a quick thank you to the Madison Square Park Conservancy, Brooke, and my fellow panelists this morning, Pamela and Ron. It's been a pleasure to be in dialogue with you both. And you know, my mission statement as a collector, Courtney, is funny because it's something that, like the collection itself, is evolving, and I think needs to be nimble and needs to respond to both changes in the art world and also changes in the greater world. And I'm gratified to hear Pamela and Ron each speak about their philosophy. I mean, my collection, people often ask me, how did you get your focus? Where did it come from? How do I have a focus as a collector, which I think is important. And I think every collection that I've admired has a focus, has a perspective, has a vision, has a point of view. For me, it started from a very personal place. My parents, I have a mixed ethnic and racial background. My father was African American. My mother was Sephardic Jewish from Morocco. And so for me, I was always made aware of being different. And second to that, my parents were also both educators. And I think from them, I learned the importance of, whatever you do in life, whatever your vocation is, wherever you work, it should have an educational component. Particularly because when you're sort of from a different background, I think that carries a weight in terms of, educating the world about perspectives that others might not otherwise be aware of. So I brought that sort of dual focus of, having a personal investment in stories of people of color and, answering sort of my own sort of questions about my family, my background, conversations I was having with my father, conversations I was having with my mother. So I brought to the collection those sort of questions. And I wanted to engage with artists who were similarly asking questions about race, about nationhood, about family, about identity. So I did that through, the exhibition Young Gifted Black was for me an opportunity to sort of foreground some of these questions that I've had about what it means to be American, what it means to be a person of mixed race, and to sort of explore that through the artists that I was in dialogue with. And, you'll often hear me talk about conversation and community. For me, that's such an important part of being a patron. The model of the art collector or patron that I sort of inherited or was familiar to me, as we were talking about before the show went live, was sort of, you sort of do it on your own. You don't talk about the work that you collect. You don't talk about where you get the work. You don't, it's a private sort of exclusive, separate arena. And so much of what I do, from, serving on boards and serving on committees, doing panels such as this, is to try to dispel that myth, especially for the next generation of collectors and patrons, for the next Pam Joiners, for the next Ron Pizzutis. I think it's important that we show ourselves and that we talk and that we're visible and we're vocal in the same way that we're vocal in our meetings when we meet with museums and curators. So the book Young Gifted Black was my way of sort of vocalizing and work that artists are first and foremost, the work that the curators who contributed texts to the book are doing, and of course, yes, the work that we, patrons, supporters of artists and museums, are doing so that we can provide a roadmap for the next generation of patrons.
Thank you so much, Bernard. That mention of the educational component, I think, is really important. It's been something that all three of you have brought into collecting and the support that you've done outside of or in alignment with collecting. Pamela, you also published books on your collection. Four Generations came out a few years ago, and it accompanied a sort of national tour, I believe, that really had a conscious focus on universities, which in turn allowed sort of facilitation of scholarship around the work. And so I wanted to ask you, why was this so important for you? And if you could tell us a little bit about that scholarship. And I'd also like to pose the question to you, Ron, about your working with, particularly with museums that are associated with universities like the Wexner and the gun galleries.
So this book was an evolution in our collecting practice. First of all, I mean, we really started collecting with a purpose to fill a void. So our collection does start in 1945 and come forward. It has a very strong slant and interest in abstraction for a whole host of reasons. And what we discovered, particularly with artists who were working sort of from the 1940s, really up until the new millennium, was that there wasn't sufficient scholarship to support the visibility, the appropriate visibility of these careers. And so our activism has been focused on both raising those profiles for artists of earlier generations and contextualizing artists who are living today and working sort of mid-career to emerging. And so when we started organizing this book, it wasn't intended to be a scholarly endeavor, but we very deliberately sought out a wide array of, established scholars. Some were voices who had been heard for many years in circles around Black art, like Mary Schmidt Campbell and Thelma Golden, and others were voices that were well-established curatorial voices, but hadn't previously written on this material. So the thought there, well, first, the observation again was that particularly around some exhibitions, there hadn't been books. And so if an exhibition exists without a book, the exhibition for all practical purposes doesn't exist, because it then becomes unresearchable for future generations of scholars. And that's how careers get systematically obscured over time. So what we were hoping to do is prompt additional scholarship post-publication, and some of that's starting to happen. We did do a mix of touring to larger institutions like the Baltimore Museum of Art and university museums like the Nasher, and so, or the Smart Museum. And what we discovered in the universities is that, renowned scholars like Darby English and Rick Powell and others used these, used the materials in the show, which was called Solidary and Solitary, as course material. Interestingly, when the show went to Notre Dame, not only did the art historians and the Black studies scholars use the material, but for instance, mathematicians taught Charles Gaines's work. And of course, that work is systems and digitally based. So we met lots of students around the country that, thought this was a revelation, and that was sort of mission accomplished for us.
Thank you, Pamela. I mean, it's really fascinating that you were able to not just have scholarship in the art history departments, but to really branch out into these other areas, which I think is something that art is able to do often, right? To think through math, philosophy, history, all of these other things.
The political scientists also got involved, and and that one, I guess it's a natural. But even when we started touring in 2017, we have ongoing social issues that spill over into, sort of a high volume situation today. But these issues were being addressed in the classroom in these contexts. And our hope is that, this will also inspire a new generation of creatives and art historians who will examine the work of Black artists, for the long term and become the tastemakers. That is actually one of the goals of our collection as well, is to help to build the pipeline of tastemakers that's more diverse than the historical representation has been among the curatorial ranks.
And Ron, for you, in terms of your work with university museums and galleries, can you speak to how some of this scholarship is, how you participate in some of this scholarship?
Well, I'd be happy to do that, but I am so impressed with Pamela's program. My God, it's wonderful that you were able to reach that many universities. The Gunn Gallery at Kenyon College is just a few years old, and it was founded by Graham Gunn, Maggie's brother, who also designed the building. And it was originally was going to be a Kunsthalle, and it ends up being a collecting institution. And they've done a great job at the school. The last two presidents have been very conscious of the the rest of the faculty. So the math professors and the history professors and the political science professors and definitely the English folks are bring their classes to the exhibitions and always find a reason to make them relative. Wexner Center has been around for 26 or 27 years now, and it caters to one of the largest student bodies in probably in the world. There's 66,000 students, at least there were before COVID, at the university, and the same thing exists there to a larger degree because of the size of the institution. Helen Molesworth and Donna DeSalvo, Chris Bedford, Carlos Basualdo, all served as curators at the Wexner Center, all of whom are in major institutions now. I don't know where Helen landed recently, but she brought scholarship to the institution, and she's a great writer. But all of them now take what they learned in Columbus to these other institutions and have it's enhanced the educational programs, and certainly in Baltimore and Philadelphia. So it's look, Wexner is a multidisciplinary institution. It's got a strong dance program, film, performing arts, and there's a great deal of integration. The curatorial staff over the years has done a good job of integrating the jazz program, for example, with Black artists. So it's anyway, it's fun being involved with both of them.
That's great. This sort of support of the ecosystem, right? We've spoken about curators being tastemakers and scholarship and what that means for artists, and obviously the alignment of institutions for each of you has been well documented. Your relationship with curators and with institutions, and museums right now are at a very critical juncture. We spoke about this briefly in some of our prior talks, but I'm curious for you guys to share, and this is for any of you. What do you think your personal responsibility is as being trustees or members of committees, particularly now as museums look inward at operations, at new funding models, staffing, support? What does sustainability look like? What does custodianship look like? In a moment like this that has such a magnification on inequality, social unrest, but also a global health crisis and other things.
I can jump in here, Courtney, just because, over the past few weeks, I've been having a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues who serve on museum boards or are on boards of arts organizations. There's also been a lot of articles and there's been a lot of discussion, from everything having to do with DEAI, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, to staff recruitment and hiring, and the makeup of boards themselves, which the Black Trustees Alliance, which Pamela is on the steering committee of, is addressing. I think it's a really important moment. I think it's an opportunity for us as patrons to think about what our role is in the institution. I think we're all accustomed to weighing in on issues of, exhibitions and acquisitions. And we also, I think, as board members, need to think about, is the mission that we are representing being fulfilled in a wholesome way with the institution? In other words, not just through exhibitions and acquisitions, but also in terms of the staff, in terms of the communities that the museums serve. And I think each institution has to find their own, has to tailor this larger mission to suit their own needs. It's not one size fits all. A board has to look like the mission that the institution is undertaking. I can speak to my own experience being on two boards, the Studio Museum in Harlem and also the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. The Studio Museum as a board, part of the conversations that we had around our new building, which is being designed by David Adjaye and under the leadership of our amazing director and chief curator, Thelma Golden, we had a decision around whether to relocate the museum if we wanted to make it bigger. And we decided to stay in Harlem, of course, because, the Studio Museum is the Studio Museum in Harlem. We are part and parcel of our community. The community needs us, and we need the community. And so that was a decision that, as a board and an organization, where we sort of saw the future and sort of exercised a sort of vision as collectively as board members. I think that with Skowhegan, Skowhegan, many of you know, is one of the longest running and highly reputed artist residencies in the country. I don't have to say anything more about how important I believe artist residencies are. Pamela can also talk about her residency in this regard. Skowhegan was started by artists for artists. The names of alums range from Ellsworth Kelly to David Driscoll to Christina Quarles to Micheline Thomas. What was really amazing for me being on the board of Skowhegan during this last period was to see how we responded as an organization to the pandemic and also to the protests. And first of all, I think for the pandemic, our program was canceled this summer, as is many other organizations. But we nevertheless doubled down on our commitment to artists. We kept the faculty that we had hired, which are artists, and our staff that run our program in Maine. We paid them through their contracts. And secondly, we also decided to do some much needed updating on the campus in terms of revitalizing the campus, making more space for artists and for the faculty, improving the setup of studios, and so that therefore future generations could benefit, from this time. So in other words, the time lost this summer not doing the program would still be spent collectively, would still be used productively for future, for future generations. I think that, board service is, I think for many people, and certainly I didn't grow up with parents who served on boards or who, took me to museums or taught me the value of collecting art. I learned that on the way. What I did learn, though, as I said about education, is that, board service for me, I look at it as a job. I look at it as work. I'm not there because my uncle or because, my coworker sort of tapped me to join. I'm there because, as Pamela, I think, has said several times, we need to be change makers. And I'm there to listen to the community that my ears are on. One of my ears is out in the community. The other ear is in the board meeting. And I think we as patrons play an important role in that sort of nexus, that interface between the world and the museum. And I think it's very important for, us to be listening to all sides and to be weighing in and to be serving as leaders, both when we're around that board meeting, for 2 hours every 4 months, we all gather and we talk about museum issues. Then we go out into the world. I think board members need to be constantly serving the mission of their institution. That's why I'm constantly in dialogue with artists from Skowhegan. I'm always talking to curators from the Studio Museum. I think we, especially now more than ever, need to see ourselves as visible, as public, as vocal advocates for museums. Whatever the issue is, whatever your personal stance is, I think the important thing is to be vocal and visible about it.
So if I can just jump in a little bit here. So as mentioned at the outset, I sit on a lot of boards, probably too many boards, but I think institutions are a really important aspect of the art ecosystem, and that's why I'm an active participant on these boards. So, I'm often asked in this environment, can you be comfortable sitting in the boardrooms of these institutions that need change? Well, I've done this for a long time. It's uncomfortable. And so it is an uncomfortable life, but I'm there to make a change, not just to nod and say yes and, accumulate some social jewelry. So even though you're right, Bernard, one size does not fit all. I do believe that at least museums have a common thread, a core business in which they are engaged, irrespective of their individual strategies. And so that's a really clarifying model for me. So what that means is I am really focused on trying to change and augment three things. One, to quote my dear friend Denise Gardner, who's the vice chair of the Art Institute of Chicago's board, works on view, WOV. That is every day that I wake up, I ask myself, how can I further the institutional ability to put artists of color works on view. Then the question is, who are the storytellers and the tastemakers? So if I were starting our collection today, I would focus keenly on the curators. I mean, I do that now, but it took me some time to learn that. They're the ones that determine what we're going to be looking at for the next 500 years. And so I'm very interested in an array of voices in the room where it happens. Now, that doesn't mean that Black curators have to be focused on Black art, but just as a business model, anytime you have diverse opinions in a room, that enhances your ability to do your business vis-a-vis your competitors. So I think that is a key input. And then finally, management. I'll lump senior staff and the board of trustees together. Also a place in need of diversity so people can develop and adhere to cutting edge ideas and strategies. And so that's really how I view institutional service. Institutions need constant evolution and reform. It is a particularly urgent issue around artists of color to rectify a history where there's been absence and mistreatment. But it applies across the board to every aspect of the business model.
I can tune in a little and just, the two of you covered it so beautifully. But I see the biggest need today, one of the biggest needs among the museums all over the country is financial. The attendance is down 75, 80% virtually everywhere. Events and museum stores that really provide a great deal of income for these institutions are closed. Or are working online. I think most of the museums, the Whitney just reopened and is doing a great job of keeping things virtual, but that only goes so far, and it doesn't really put money in the bank. So I commend both of you for your comments. You covered it beautifully, but we also need to look at how to continue to make sure these museums survive, because we're going to have some fallout soon.
I think Ron, is an interesting point that you make, and it's a challenge, I think, because in terms of diversifying museum boards is that, we still need to make sure that museums have the financial support that they need to do everything that you say needs to be done. At the same time, we need to balance those realities with the need for economic diversity, for instance, on board members. It's not just a matter of adding a Black board member or more women board members. It's also a matter of adding board members that have a range of, diversity of thought and perspective and experience, which would include economic diversity. I think museums need to look at what their nut is, what they need every year from this pot of money, from grants, from patrons, from membership, from retail, and figure out what those amounts are, and then sort of take a second layer look at who and where are we going to get that money from. And then I think by the time you get to the board, then you can really be creative in terms of, okay, we need this amount from the board. We can count on this amount from this person or that amount from that group. That should free up some opportunity to bring in the kind of diversity and the diversity that's also required. So my hope is that, in an ideal world, we can sort of get to both. We can get to a balanced budget. We can get to economic health, but we can also address the issues of, what the board looks like and who the board is. I don't think it's easy. I don't think anybody wants to be put on a board just because they check a box. I think that doesn't serve anybody in the long run. I think that we need board members who have quality and a range of qualities and experience, not just board members who are focused on a particular kind of artist or a particular kind of, medium. So I think it makes it very complicated, but it's a challenge that I'm excited about. I think it's a challenge that forums like this, we can begin to come up with some solutions and take them back to our institutions.
Well, I think, Bernard, that if you go back to sort of the old paradigm of how American cultural institutions intended to manage and fund themselves, right? Earlier there was an emphasis on work, wisdom, and wealth was one of the components.
That's great.
In the current financial situation, wealth has to be, a key consideration. But I think the onus is on boards of trustees to examine themselves and figure out what skill sets are required. So I don't go on a board or stay on a board where I don't have a job description. And someone has to be able to explain to me not just what my role is, but what my nearly unique value added is, right? Because if I can't play a distinctive role, I don't belong in the room.
I think that also, I think all museum boards require board members not only the ability to write checks, but to have a passion for the art form. And I've seen a trend recently that there's been less emphasis on diversity until recently, and more emphasis on those who can write checks. And many of these folks don't even enter the institution. And I'm talking about my part of the country. This is we operate a lot differently than both coasts do. But it's so important that regardless whether you're on a symphony board or a museum board, that you're passionate about the art form you're representing.
Is there any conversations that you guys are having about government support in some of these institutions? I mean, over the last decade or so, I think that there's been more of an onus on individual supporters and less support from the government, which of course changes, I think, the types of shows that happen, the types of artists that are shown. And so I'm curious if sort of the civic component in supporting institutions has been something that has come up in terms of bringing that back in the way maybe it happens in Europe versus here in the US.
I think I was talking with someone yesterday and they were like, what government support for art institutions? Maybe we should answer that question after November 3rd. I would like to think, as Pamela said, I love that work, wisdom, and wealth. I would like to think that in America, the system that we have, that if we just drill down on those concepts and be a little bit more creative and try a little bit harder to really tap the full range of what those three qualities are and where those three qualities can come from, I would like to see that we would retain sort of control over our institutions. And by that, I just mean in the hands of board members who are committed, who are civic minded. Government, you don't need a government to be civic. You can be civic on your own. You can take that on yourself, as Pamela was saying, as Ron is pointing out. I think the civic duty comes when board members like us and anybody who's listening on this call, please, if there's an organization or a museum that you're thinking about, that you're excited about, or that you think could use your help, to Pamela's point, if you have a unique skill or perspective, or if you do want to make a big donation, money is obviously very important, then I think now is your chance to speak up. We don't need necessarily government to do all of that for us. I would like to let the art world give it the old college try to support, find ways of supporting each other. I mean, Hauser and Wirth, just as an example, this week, Artists for New York is an amazing benefit auction, it's not an auction, sorry, it's a benefit exhibition, which is meant to support a host of New York-based institutions that were not able to hold galas this year, and to raise money to support those institutions. No one in Washington is going to tell us, Hauser and Wirth, to come up with that idea. That idea comes up from the people who lead these galleries, the leaders of those institutions, to come up with a plan and realize that, normally I know galleries and museums were sort of on different sides of the table, but right now we need to work together. And I think that kind of creative thinking is what we need. And that's what we will get. That's how we will get to a balanced budget, like as Ron points out. And also that's how we will get to the vision that Pamela says of board members being, embodying wealth, wisdom, and work in the fullest, broadest, most diverse sense of those words.
I agree with that. I mean, I think we have a unique situation, as you point out, Courtney, in this country. And being long affiliated with a European-based institution and on that board, if you watch the European institutions, they all are very aggressively focused on trying to find private patrons so they are not as beholden to the vicissitudes of government funding. And Ron, being a Midwest girl myself, I would give a shout out to Midwestern institutions who, you know, have boards that are populated with people who are really civically minded. You know, I think on the coast you have people who are a little bit more individualistic in their approaches, but the notion that in order to enhance the community in Columbus or Chicago, that one has a civic obligation to support the cultural institutions, even if, you know, you don't know an Oz clip from The Wizard of Oz. I think that that's a quintessentially American phenomenon, and there's something to mine there that is really important.
This is going to be our last question because we're beginning to run out of time. But speaking about sort of the support of individual board members or patrons of museums, and I know that each of you has your own history of gifting work to institutions, bringing your private holdings to be shown in institutions. You know, Pamela, it was just announced that SF MoMA will have Jordan Castile's painting from the cover of Vogue on view. And Ron, I know that you have, of course, brought recently some work to the Gun Gallery at Kenyon College. So I'm curious about the, I mean, there's obviously sort of an impact that this has on the respective artists' careers. But are there other reasons for taking this action? And how do you find the context of the works themselves change when it goes from being on your private walls to these public walls?
We could still visit it. And years ago, when we had a mortgage payment due, and I had to sell a Chuck Close painting that's now at the Whitney, and I just love it when it's hung in the permanent galleries. So it's we've just recently given somewhere between 40 and 50 works to the Columbus Museum. And I'm anxious for them to start showing them. Two of the pieces are in Columbia, South Carolina today. We have an Indian program that's traveled, an Indian show that traveled. And so I'm anxious to go to Columbia, South Carolina, just to see work that we previously owned. So I'm good with it. And we probably will continue to spread things around.
This gets back to your question, Courtney, about, you know, are you a sort of privately focused art collector, or are you a civically minded art patron? You know, art history is not written on my walls, it's written on museum walls. And I feel that, you know, my role here, while I'm, you know, on this planet, is to steward, you know, support and galvanize these artists' careers. And, you know, I'm grateful to be able to live with their work. I'm grateful for the community that I have, to be in dialogue with great patrons like Ron and Pamela, to be able to support the institutions that I love so much. And I feel that, you know, if you know, if you look at your role as a patron in that way, then you sort of see a sort of pathway forward whereby, you know, you serve the artists and you serve the mission for your time, and then you pass that on to someone else or to other places. And obviously that takes different forms to different patrons. But I feel that, you know, at the end of the day, we need to support the places and the people that will carry forth these histories forward. And again, a hats off to Pamela for supporting scholarship. You know, my father, who was a professor, I think never imagined that I would be an art patron speaking about the importance of scholarship, but I really do feel like that's also part of what a patron can do, is sort of support the writing of history, the rewriting of art history, so that future generations can understand what these artists were doing and what these exhibitions meant. It's a tradition that Black patrons have done for a long time, whether it was just holding exhibitions in their home. You know, there's a Black theorist who talks about, you know, the importance of the Black home as a place where communities gather, where artists gather, where work is shown that is then passed on down to generations. And I think that's the model that I try to follow, and I'm hoping that others listening on the call today will sort of hear some of this and be inspired to do similarly what Ron and Pamela are talking about.
So we do a fair amount of that, Bernard. In normal times, we probably host 24 museum groups and collector groups in our home. We are active lenders. At any given point in time, we have 30 to 100 works of art out on loan. And that is just a part of the stewardship we believe in as a collection. Every time a painting like Jordan Castillo's Aurora hangs on a wall, it rewrites a piece of art history. We have a little problem here in California right now because our walls are threatening to burn. So we really don't want a lot of that stuff in Sonoma. And that particular painting was slated to go to Sonoma, and I thought, never mind. And we also like to support museums that are making progress in their own efforts to diversify their collections. So in the last 12 months, we've given away 60 works of art. And the idea there, so when SF MoMA, for instance, reopened, in addition to the Jordan Castile, there's probably another dozen works that have been gifted to them by us, woven into the permanent collection to complete an accurate telling of the art historical story.
Thank you guys so much. I would love to take some questions from the audience. And one is about public art and monument making. And I think this has a lot to do with our conversation about civically minded art collectors and supporters. And it's certainly at the forefront of the national conversation today, you know, public art as being inextricably linked to race, power, and institutional infrastructure. What are your feelings around the future of public art, and what would you like to see happen either to the existing monuments or for future monuments?
I would like to see more government support. I live in the 14th largest metropolitan area in the United States, and we are the largest city in America without a really comprehensive public art program. And the reason for that is we get almost no support from the various governmental agencies, for the county and the city and the state for that matter. And there's been a trend nationally among universities and art institutions that were once supported by, and now they're just merely aided. You know, universities in Ohio, for example, used to be 98% supported by the government, and now it's down to 17%. And the numbers are even lower among the art institutions. So we need stronger support from the government, and we should take that into consideration when we're selecting our elected officers.
So I'm going to make a controversial statement, but I'm going to try to do so diplomatically. I would like to see resource that is focused on public art, focused on bringing new, previously unheard voices to the fore, and less on, you know, whatever is existing.
I hope everybody out there listening hears that, and we can start that. I second that notion, Pamela, and I hope that there's a curator there at the Public Art Fund or the High Line here in New York who's listening and who now has an action plan for the next season's programming. You know, public art is so important, I think, especially in the pandemic, you know, as we all have sort of dispersed to our homes elsewhere. And by that, I mean kids going back to live with their parents, people moving out of cities. You know, as much as we love MoMA, as much as I love MoMA, Studio Museum, the Whitney here in New York, Pamela, as much as you talk about being a Chicago gal, love the Art Institute of Chicago, the MCA, you know, the reality is that most of the country does not live in these art-focused cities or these art-healthy cities. And so much of the inspiration for me with Young, Gifted, and Black was taking this exhibition to places where art might not otherwise get seen, especially Black art, especially art made by emerging artists of African descent. So, you know, art is happening in many more places than in our own big cities. And I feel like public art is a big component of that. Those who can't go to museums, who don't think of going to museums, will encounter art in public places. And that art ought to represent and reflect who they are. I mean, I think art needs to show us the future. It also needs to show us ourselves. It's a mirror of our own society. And if we have art in public places that is not reflecting the public or the place, then that's a disservice. It's a big problem. It's very important. And I feel that the importance around support for public art is something which can't be underestimated, particularly in this moment when many more people are now in different places than their normal home-based cities. Yeah, I just think, I mean, hats off to organizations, as I mentioned already, the Highline, the Public Art Fund, Creative Time, Madison Square Park, our host tonight, has an amazing record of doing groundbreaking public art programs. For me, it was, something which I get to experience whenever I'm walking through Madison Square, through that part of the city. I was doing one of the protests, the family-friendly protests in June with my children, and we stopped actually at the halfway point of the protest and sat down at a bench at Madison Square Park. And I realized how important that place is, that site is, in the middle of New York City, in the middle of what that time was such a moment of, of struggle and stress and awareness and excitement, that the park served a really central part symbolically that day for that march, but it serves that role every day. It's public parks. Our parks are where people come together, where we meet people who we wouldn't otherwise meet. And art should be a focus point of that. Art should drive that conversation. It shouldn't alienate people. It shouldn't make people feel like they're not being represented.
There's a question in the chat that I think speaks to that point, and also to yours, Pamela, about artists that might not have such a large visibility. It's from Nicholas Lewis. It says, in the last several years, we have seen a resurgence, or a rather targeted focus, on African-American artists that have not been duly appreciated in the market, like Norman Lewis, Sam Gilliam, Howardina Pindell, etc. What can we do to shine the light on other artists of that generation who have entire bodies of work that are not being appreciated or recognized?
I'll do 2 seconds on that. And so a big role that I think is important to play in the boardroom or in museum associations is to ask one question, which is, have you considered? So when I talk to curators all the time, I say, have you considered this career or that career? And so that's part of my responsibility in the institutional arena.
I also think you need to look at the artists that are making good work in other parts of the world. If you're not in the West Coast or the East Coast or London or now even Beijing, you don't get discovered and you don't get the opportunity to showcase your work.
We have a great question here from Gary Garrido Schneider, the Executive Director of Grounds for Sculpture in New Jersey. He says, I've been watching with great interest the bold deaccessioning occurring at a handful of museums with goal of directing proceeds towards addressing the gross underrepresentation in collections and issues of equity. I know there is recent pushback this week to the BMA, not looking to stir controversy, but curious of the panelists' thoughts as individual collectors in regards to evolution of their own collections and as trustees to these developments.
So I'm on the board of one of those institutions that has engaged in that endeavor. And that really started 2 years ago with the sale of a Rothko. The then senior curator, Gary Garrels, made some masterful acquisitions. And I mean, even today, when you go to the SF MoMA, you can see, the recently acquired Norman Lewis and Sam Gilliam and Alma Thomas hung in the full context of where they always should have been hung in the modernist canon. And so I'm a real proponent of that approach. It's been very effective in certain environments. And then what I've tried to do, so, I gave a, large percentage of our collection done by artists born before 1930 to the SF MoMA, so they could further contextualize that story and tell that story in greater depth. So it was a real and deliberate collaboration that we hope will make a long-term difference.
And then we have a conversation about, or a question rather, about philanthropy from Will Paley. He says, how do you continue to make an amazing impact while also making room to allow voices who are less affluent to also have an impact at the board level, local community organizers, academics, artists, etc. We spoke a bit about this in terms of the diversity of boards and not just looking at those who have the bank accounts to support in a major way.
Again, one of the key obligations, that group of activities that you just described I would say is more the purview of management than it is the purview of the board. However, the board must hold management accountable for measurable results in terms of how it interacts with all of those various constituencies.
Yeah, I agree with Pamela. I think it's not our job to tell management how to do their job, but we need to hold them accountable, and there needs to be measurable benchmarks. There needs to be sort of progress reports. There needs to be, a way of checks and balances, as it were.
And then lastly, this is from Rocio Aranda Alvarado. Since we have been talking about making space for artists of color since at least the mid-1960s, how can we make real change? We hear a lot of talk about the pipeline, but what happens when there are no jobs at the end of the pipeline? Museums need to make space for people of color at the curatorial level, not just in education, where they have been trying to do work for decades. How can we encourage museums to create these much needed positions?
The
Well,
question is about.
Go ahead, Bernard.
No, I was just to clarify, restate the question. The question is about what can museums do to create more jobs?
It sounds like she wants to know how can we create jobs at the curatorial level that will bring diversity, or how can we encourage diversity at the curatorial level rather than in the departments where people of color have largely been, like the Department of Education.
Right.
So again, I think that is an obligation that board members have around holding management responsible. But also board members can accelerate and facilitate that process by helping museums fund those positions. So for instance, at SF MoMA this summer, we had for the first time an internship program that was focused on interns of color that, I just said, let's do it and I'll fund part of it. And so, I think that's one way to get people to respond. But I agree. Susan Cahan wrote a wonderful book about, the interest in Black art and inclusion in the 1960s. And we haven't made enough progress. But this time we have to not only focus on intentions, but outcomes. And hopefully the Black Trustee Alliance will be formulating certain strategies that enable institutions to have a roadmap to do so.
Yeah, the other thing about internships too, which we often talk about at MoMA and the Studio Museum, which have a great internship partnership program. Again, the kind of thing that I think we as institutional supporters and the people in power in these institutions can do much better than, say, government, for instance. We have an exchange internship program between Studio and MoMA, whereby the interns spend half the year at Studio Museum and the other half the year at MoMA working in a curatorial department. One of the challenges with internships, at least in New York City, has been how are they funded? Because for a long time, these internships weren't really well funded. And so you can imagine what it costs to live in New York City for a summer and what kind of diversity you would get using that criteria if you couldn't support or augment your interns with a stipend. I think that kind of support, that kind of financial support has to happen earlier and earlier. I think in graduate schools, there need to be clear I think the Mellon Foundation is involved with this. Ford Foundation also with Darren Walker, I think, is involved with this. There need to be scholarships. There needs to be more money, basically more money put into the pipeline earlier in the process so that, someone who's a college student deciding whether to go work as get an internship at Bain Capital or at JP Morgan can look at this other opportunity and go be an intern at the Whitney or MoMA instead and financially survive that summer. It just has to happen earlier. It has to happen. Art history programs can't just be the province of, of a certain class or a certain background of person, which it has been traditionally. It needs to be, people need to see art and the study of art and the making of exhibitions as a really vital, important part of society, and especially in this moment. I would hope that people come out of this moment realizing that artists can show us the future if we just stop and look, and if we give them a chance and give them the means to do so. So I think it's a challenge. I think it's important to think about, again, how we can create incentives earlier in the pipeline so that by the time art history students graduate from college and decide to make a career, or at least to try to make a career in the art world, that they feel like they have a reasonable chance of success.
Bernard, I think that's a resounding, wonderful way to conclude our conversation today. On behalf of Madison Square Park Conservancy, we're so grateful for your participation this morning in such a stimulating and pressing dialogue. You have each buoyed the field and our understanding of the field and really shared a roadmap for others. So thank you, Bernard and Ron and Pamela, for speaking today with great candor and insight. And Courtney, thank you for guiding the conversation. Stay well, everyone. The comments in the chat have been all thumbs up. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.